Alexandria, Virginia, 2016. A young female lifeguard is raped at work.
That was the most severe sexual offense crime that I'd come across in my career at that time.
I think what was the most frightening was how well planned out it was, how calm he was. The level of calm that he exhibited really, it just exuded that he knew that he wasn't going to get caught.
Police soon learn of a previous attack in Fairfax, Virginia, 2 years prior.
As far as the sexual acts and the statements that were made, they were almost identical to our offense, down to the order of events and the exact words that were said to the victim.
There's obviously a great deal of worry that the person is going to strike again.
Police soon hit a dead end.
There was a lot of uncertainty caused by it because of the lack of information, because the police didn't have any information to provide. They weren't withholding it. There just wasn't any information to provide.
It was the detective team that first proposed perhaps using genetic genealogy to look into the matter.
This is the story of 2 brutal rapes, the premeditation behind them, and how the Bloodline Detectives caught their suspect before he could attack again.
The genetic genealogy technique led us to identify a nurse at the local hospital, basically living just for all intents and purposes, a normal middle-class American life, except that he had this a really, really startling and frightening dark side to him.
This is a case like sticks with you. This victim is somebody's daughter. This guy needs to be put away forever.
September the 3rd, 2016, City of Alexandria Police in Virginia receive an emergency call about a young female lifeguard who has been sexually assaulted. Officers are dispatched to the scene.
I first got involved when I was on duty at the time, and I got the call for service to respond. I was about 2 or 3 miles away from the actual incident location. The incident occurred in essentially a pool house for a condominium and townhouse neighborhood. I get there, it's the end of summer or the beginning of fall, and it's a little cool outside. The pool is empty, it's overcast, so there was no one swimming that day, or no one was gonna be swimming that day. Standard pool house, to the left is the women's changing room, to the right is the men's changing room. Since the victim was a woman, I called out into the women's changing room, and I heard her calling from the pool. So I went through the female changing room and into the pool, and that's when I encountered her right outside the women's changing room, right into the pool area. She was able to get a jacket or something across her shoulders, but other than that, she was essentially naked with her hands bound behind her back, crying. Her makeup was very, very smeared. Not in shock, but very, very panicked. I almost thought that she wasn't too comfortable with me when I was on scene because of what just happened to her. So she kind of stepped back when I got there. The most reassuring way possible. It's like, police, I'm here to help. What happened? Are you okay? Are you okay? The first thing. Are you hurt? And then realizing that her hands need to be cut free. So I went to look for her hands. As soon as I was able to get them from out of the jacket, I found that the zip ties that she was tied with were so tight, her hands were blue. And she was definitely losing circulation. The zip ties looked like they had been cutting into her skin. So as soon as I could, I took my pocket knife out and very, very carefully, considering how tight those zip ties, worked my pocket knife in between and cut her free. In the process, cutting my own thumb while I was cutting her free.
Officer Sanderson tries to figure out who the victim is and to get a sense of the surroundings.
The victim was a lifeguard. She was here just for the summer. She was from an Eastern European nation. We're right outside of Washington, D.C., so it's a heavily populated area. In the summer, there's a lot of pools, and we have a lot of people coming from outside of the U.S. to come here and serve as lifeguards. So she was very young. She was only here temporarily, and indeed, this was relatively late in the summer. She was probably finishing up her time here, unfortunately, when this terrible incident occurred.
The swimming pool's in a kind of small neighborhood of townhouses and condos. The neighborhood itself sits on a hill, and the pool is near the top of the hill. It's surrounded by a fence and by a lot of trees, so there's not a lot of visibility into the pool area. The pool's only used by residents of that neighborhood. And again, it's a pretty small neighborhood. It's a small pool. She was the only lifeguard working there at the time. There's one lifeguard at the pool. And so there are, often days where no one would come to that pool at all, and the lifeguard would just be there by themselves. And this was one of those days, especially because of the weather. So she was there by herself all day.
The development itself is not gated in any way, so anyone can drive in and out of the development. They'd have to know there's a pool back there, obviously. Pool itself wasn't very large. You've got a pool, you've got a pool deck with some chairs on it, and there's a small office. And of course, it's got a gate and a fence around it, but it's not secure in any way.
Officer Sanderson gets a short account of events while other officers are dispatched.
So she did want to use the restroom. I was looking for stuff around the area, and she actually did make it into the restroom. I knocked on the door, and I asked her point blank, were you raped? And she answers back, yes. I was like, I need you to stop, get off the toilet, do not flush. And she said, okay. And she actually was very, very responsive in this and came out of the stall, and I was able to preserve whatever was in the toilet, and then also was able to start talking to her, asking her exactly where everything happened so I can start securing that crime scene. She was able to tell me the location, where exactly it happened. And it happened in, we call it the pump room. The pumps for the swimming pool is about the size of a closet. And that's where she told me the offense took place. So I made sure nobody could walk in there, and made sure nobody walked in there, and closed that off.
Medics arrive to bring the survivor to the hospital.
Both to check on her and then ultimately to take her to the hospital for a sexual assault exam. The sexual assault exam has a number of components. So there's an external examination where the nurses will document injuries to the body. So they looked at, for example, her wrists had very deep abrasions in them from the zip ties. There were abrasions on her back from where the zip ties had dug into her back while she was placed on her back. Everywhere externally to see signs of bruising or abrasions that were caused by the assault. They also do an internal exam for a number of reasons to look for injuries. In a rape case, it's actually relatively rare to have internal injuries, but the victim in this case did have a rather significant internal injury. The nurses also use the internal and external exam to collect evidence, to look for DNA or anything else that might have been left behind. So here they took a number of samples, both internally and externally, to look for the DNA of the perpetrator. What occurs during the SANE exam is dependent upon what the victim reports occurred. So because the victim here had reported that he had placed his mouth on her breast during the attack, they did swab her breast area for saliva, any DNA that would have been left behind there. She had also reported that during the course of the rape that he had ejaculated and that he had not used a condom. So the nurses observed what appeared to be semen inside of her, and they took swabs both internally and externally to look for DNA that might be contained in there.
Police give the victim time before interviewing her about the brutal attack.
It's typically our practice, whenever it's possible, to give rape victims at least 2 sleep cycles before we do a full interview with all of the details of the offense. They interviewed her Tuesday morning after Labor Day to get the full story.
It was a gray afternoon, Labor Day weekend. There was nobody else at the pool. And later that afternoon, someone came up to her and asked if he'd left his flip-flops there.
So the victim kind of helped them look around. Generally at the pool, they have some sort of lost and found. And so she had taken them to the area at the clubhouse, which was the pump room, kind of looked around, no flip-flops, and he left. Short time later, the gentleman returned, kind of asking the same questions, looking for flip-flop shoes, and she agreed to help him look again.
She did notice that this time when she was walking around that he didn't seem to be looking like he was before. He was just kind of following around behind her.
And at this time, that's when they go over to the clubhouse, the pump room, and checks again. And then when she turns around, he produces a firearm.
Told her that he would shoot her if she screamed.
He put on some blue latex gloves.
And tied her wrists together with zip ties.
And at one point, he sticks a piece of tissue in her mouth.
He repeatedly told her that he might shoot her. He did tell her that he was going to rape her or kill her or both. He also strangled her, put his hand on her neck.
And then at that point, he starts to lift her shirt, licks her breasts, starts attempting to try and have sex with her. That time he was not erect at the time, so he stuck his fingers in her vagina. That must have aroused him. At this point he's on top of her. His penis enters her vagina. She laid there. She recalls his face against hers and the heavy breathing.
He got off of her, patted her on the shoulder, and left. So she waited a little while to make sure that he was gone, and then got up.
There was no cell phone really on scene or anything like that. The only phone was a 1980s corded phone that was on a windowsill that was just about the right height where her hands would have been when they were tied behind her back. And she dialed the phone number from memory without looking at the keyboard and called her boyfriend and also the pool manager.
Alarmed by the premeditation of the attack, an investigation team assembles to track down the rapist.
I think what was the most frightening was how well planned out it was, how calm he was, but also the victim herself. She said from the very beginning with absolute certainty, he has done this before and he will do it again.
Forensic technicians scour the crime scene for clues but come up short.
The initial stages of the investigation were to look at the crime scene. There was very little there. There were no latex gloves or gun. Nothing was left behind or recovered. There was very little evidence at all at the scene. So the investigators there just basically documented what the pool looked like, what the pump room looked like, collected her clothing, collected the zip ties that had been cut off. So the detectives really started with the most basic aspect of the investigation, which was just looking for witnesses. What felt like the entire police department descended upon the neighborhood, knocking on every door, leaving flyers, asking anybody if they had seen anything, but very, very few leads, and no one had seen anything out of the ordinary that day. So they were very much at a dead end at the very beginning of the investigation.
The police try to create a sketch of the perpetrator with the victim.
The victim sat down with a sketch artist early on. It had been the hope of the police department that as a result of that interview that they'd be able to release the sketch and ask the public for help in finding the person. But after sitting with the sketch artist for quite a long period of time, the victim didn't feel like the sketch that was produced looked like the perpetrator, and we weren't confident that it would get any leads based upon that, so they weren't able to release that.
Police become aware of another rape of a lifeguard 2 years prior to the attack in Alexandria.
We were pretty quickly aware of a similar offense in Fairfax County involving a lifeguard. It's rare for us to have this kind of violent sexual assault in this area. Can't say it never happens, but it's relatively rare. And then to find that within just a couple of years, a similar offense involving a lifeguard at a secluded pool just a couple of miles away from the location of our offense had occurred.
While the victim was still in the hospital getting the sexual assault exam, her boyfriend mentioned to the police that there had been another lifeguard who had been raped a year or two before in Fairfax. It was somewhat odd for him to have that information and to have it so readily and so soon after the offense. So police initially were somewhat suspicious of him for bringing that up and for having that information before they learned that it actually was related and relevant information.
Investigators look back at the incident in Fairfax, Virginia.
That incident that occurred in Fairfax County was approximately 2 years prior to ours, so in 2014. Just like the incident that happened in ours, the weather wasn't so great. A male suspect came to the pool with a similar type ruse.
Nobody else was at the pool. A man came up and asked about how he could get a pool pass. And the lifeguard told him what he needed to do.
He was wearing sunglasses, which did strike her as strange, given that it was kind of a rainy, cloudy day. In retrospect, obviously, it appears that he was trying to conceal his identity.
The man left after that conversation, but he came back a couple of hours later and said that he thought he'd left his sunglasses behind and asked the lifeguard if she would do him a favor and go check for them.
Also the same, similar in ours. Got her into the pool house there.
He pulled out a gun and said, "This is a robbery." The lifeguard said she didn't have any money. The man pushed her to the ground. He tied plastic wrist ties around her wrist, and he put something over her mouth.
And proceeded to try and rape her.
As far as the sexual acts and the statements that were made, they were almost identical to our offense, down to the order of events and the exact words that were said to the victim. The one big difference between the two offenses was that in Fairfax, the victim felt a sharp pain in her bottom right before feeling very woozy and passing out. So in the Fairfax offense, the victim was drugged.
Well, even though she was drowsy, she could feel that the man was groping her.
The last thing she remembered before passing out was that he did, in fact, rape her. And she passed out, woke up feeling very groggy sometime later, was able to make her way out of the pool house into a nearby home where she asked some of the neighbors to call for help.
Police arrive and tend to the victim and try to get any information they can about the perpetrator.
The Fairfax victim was able, once the officers arrived, to provide a description of a white man in his 30s with a little bit of a beard. He was wearing a ball cap at the time and a t-shirt.
The suspect was described in a similar manner, led us to pretty quickly assume that the two must be linked.
The victim in the Fairfax case was likewise taken for a sexual assault exam, an internal and external exam. There were no sperm identified or DNA identified from the swabs from her body. However, there was DNA, a very small amount of DNA found in her underwear.
Investigators link the two attacks by using the DNA found on each of the victims.
That DNA was sent to the lab. A Y chromosome profile was developed, which is a profile that's developed only from the male portion of the DNA. So using that type of analysis, we're able to compare DNA to a full profile, but it's not as high or as statistically significant as the comparison of a full profile. But nonetheless, it is helpful to have that DNA and to be able to do the comparison.
The DNA from both scenes was compared. That link took a little bit longer. It was a matter of a couple of months before we had definitive proof that the two were linked.
The victim in the Fairfax case was likewise a seasonal lifeguard here on a work visa, and this was near the end of the season. I believe the Fairfax offense was in August. It was striking to the investigators that in both cases, he selected victims with obvious foreign accents, working in jobs that are, in our area, frequently worked by students who are here on work visas from overseas, and that these offenses were committed at or near the end of summer when these students would be going back to their home countries. So it struck us that he was perhaps selecting these victims because, quite simply, that they wouldn't be around to prosecute the offenses once they went back home.
With the knowledge of a potential serial rapist, Alexandria police look for different methods to try to identify the perpetrator.
The first step that was tried was a phenotype analysis. Basically what that allows is to use the DNA to produce what amounts really to a computer-generated composite sketch in an effort to produce some likeness of the person, perhaps hopefully a better likeness than the composite sketch that was originally used in the matter. So we were able to obtain a computer-generated composite sketch based on the DNA profile. The police did release that to the media, and the hope, of course, is that it's going to spur tips, leads, and some tips did come in. My recollection is that we did receive some tips, but most of them were very, very, very soft. Things like, I saw a guy that looked like that on the bus the other day. Nothing that could really be followed up, nothing concrete, and nothing that led to the identification of a suspect.
The idea of a lifeguard being raped while at her job at a deserted pool was shocking to anybody who heard that. It was a shocking story to report on. I think that every person who's ever worked a job where they're by themselves, the thought had crossed their mind at least at some point that just being alone like that could put you at risk.
There was a lot of fear in the community, especially in that neighborhood. It was a very quiet neighborhood, a very small neighborhood, and there were a lot of questions from the people in the immediate area about what the investigation was, why it hadn't yielded a suspect, and why there wasn't any more information. There was a lot of uncertainty caused by it because of the lack of information, because the police didn't have any information to provide. They weren't withholding it. There just wasn't any information to provide.
There's obviously a great deal of worry that the person is going to strike again. I think there is, unfortunately, kind of like, when are we going to be able to identify this person? So there's a great deal of pressure on trying to find the perpetrator. But I would point out, I don't think the community pressure was as tough as the pressure on the detectives that they bring on themselves. The detectives that work this case really take cases like this to heart, and they refuse to give up.
Detectives in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, are on the hunt for a serial predator who has raped 2 young lifeguards in August 2014 and September 2016. With no concrete leads, investigators turn to a new DNA method to help solve the case.
The detectives approached my office with the idea of enlisting Parabon to assist. We had some conversation about that. I'll be honest, at the very beginning of this, I wasn't convinced that it would be useful. I felt like it was a shot in the dark and it was something that was being tried because we had nothing else to try. But this was several years ago, and while the technique had been used before and Parabon had been used in criminal investigations before, I wasn't particularly well versed in the methods and how it works. And this was about the time that the Golden State Killer case was really groundbreaking news. And the detectives who were involved, who really felt that this had a great chance of working, used that case, the Golden State case, as an example of the power of genetic genealogy. And it was the combined force of, hey, we really have reached a dead end in the investigation, coupled with trying to find this offender before he struck again, and also the fact that the technique had worked in other jurisdictions, that led us to believe that we needed to give it a shot. We laid out some parameters about the need for obtaining search warrants wherever possible, and then the detectives took it and proceeded forward and tried to use the genetic genealogy technique to find and identify a potential offender.
Genetic genealogy is a groundbreaking crime-solving tool, and investigators are keen to understand the process involved.
Human beings very interested in genealogy. They take their own DNA sample, they turn it into a private company which maintains a database, and the database can comprise literally millions of DNA profiles. Then you take a known sample from an offense, you've got a DNA profile that you've not been able to identify, and you basically use the millions of DNA profiles that have been uploaded to the internet, uploaded to this database that's kept in the cloud, and you try to use it to compare and then establish some potential familial relationships between the offender's DNA and people that are actually have their profiles in the cloud on the database. You're not, in other words, you're not necessarily actually looking for quote unquote a match. Instead, what you're looking for is substantially close DNA profiles that kind of narrow down the potential family connections for the offender. And through the family connections, if you can get someone with a close enough DNA profile to the offender's profile, you can then use maybe normal detective techniques to try to narrow down the field to potential offenders.
Using a mix of the ancestry information and then social media information, right? Because it says, oh, it's somebody in this family, and then you figure out how many people in this family live in this area, how many of them are of an age where they could do this, how many of them are male. And so then they came down to, it seems like it's this person, right?
I do remember very clearly the day when the detectives told me that they thought they had narrowed it down to a potential offender, and they informed me that he not only lived in Arlington County, but that he worked at our local hospital. I had a real immediate visceral reaction, and I was convinced of the capabilities of genetic genealogy. I mean, to use the technique to find somebody who matched the description, was in the right age group, lived a couple of miles away, and worked in the city was really amazing. And at that point, we were pretty confident we had the right guy, but we still had a lot of work to do.
Alexandria police began to think about Jesse Bjerka as a possible suspect, and they staked him out.
They went to his apartment. They looked through his trash. They tried to get a DNA match from his trash, but were unsuccessful. They followed him and his wife to a restaurant in Old Town Alexandria, and then after they left, they picked up the straws from their table, and they took those, and that's how they were able to get his DNA.
The items from the trash and the straws were all submitted to the lab to be compared with the STR profile that had been developed from the DNA that had been found in the sexual assault kit from the victim. They were determined to be, first and foremost, all from the same person, and then also a match.
It couldn't be eliminated as a match, after which they started looking at him more closely. They looked at his cell phone records, saw that his cell phone had been turned off during the time of this attack, saw that he had left work early, saying he was sick the day of the attack, and then they got a search warrant.
We took the case before the grand jury, and the grand jury issued warrants. We set up our surveillance again back at the residence. When he left, he drove into the city of Alexandria here. Traffic stop was initiated, and he was placed under arrest.
He appeared oddly unsurprised and calm when he was informed of what he was being arrested for. After he was placed in the police cruiser, he was taken back to the police station and interviewed by the police.
He was cooperative. Yeah, I think he was a little afraid. Having not been in this situation, he had no criminal history. We talked for a little while. He denied raping a lifeguard. Going into an interview like this with somebody who's committed these sort of crimes, it's almost like a chameleon. They're good actors. There were some questions of why I'm here, you know, those sort of things. Some nervousness, some things you would expect for somebody who's never been arrested before or have been caught for crimes they've committed.
While he is in custody, officers obtain evidence to concretely identify Jesse Bjerka as the perpetrator.
After he was arrested, then the detectives executed a search warrant to obtain a buccal swab from him so that a known DNA comparison could be done. The Department of Forensic Science was able to calculate statistics that were related to the comparison, finding that it was 1 in 7.2 billion, which is approximately the world population.
With Bjerka now officially charged with the rapes, investigators start looking for further incriminating evidence.
We made an arrest. Now we're working backwards to try and gather as much evidence as possible as far back as we can go. We got search warrants for his residence. We got search warrant for his car, for his cell phone, for his work locker at a Nova Alexandria hospital. And we were just kind of looking for anything that could place him at the scene, any evidence, of getting rid of anything, any evidence of how to commit these crimes. For example, his phone, there was a lot of crime articles, stuff, particular genealogy sort of stuff that we ended up recovering.
The second thing we were able to determine from his cell phone records was his location at the time. And we were able to determine that for the Alexandria offense, that he was present, that his phone was hitting off the tower right next to the pool just prior to the first time that the victim reported that he entered the pool claiming to have lost his flip-flops. Now, the location evidence ended there, but what was significant was that the phone appeared to have been either put into airplane mode or turned off after that time. And in looking at his records, the detectives and investigators looked back for some period of time and found very, very few other instances where his phone went off, and definitely not during the day like that. So that appeared to us to be a conscious attempt to conceal his location during that time by turning his phone off or putting it in airplane mode for the exact time period that the offense occurred. The detectives were very detailed on what they were looking for to corroborate the offense. So, for example, blue latex gloves. We were also doing a search warrant for the Fairfax offense as well, in that their perpetrator and our perpetrator were one and the same, even though the Fairfax offense hadn't been charged yet. So we were looking for ketamine, for syringes. One of the things we included in the search warrant was any photo of him from the time of either offense. We did learn in looking at his DMV history and on social media that his appearance had changed rather drastically since 2014 and 2016. He had lost a lot of weight, he had lost a decent amount of hair, and he had also started to go gray a little bit and had grown a beard. At certain times he was clean shaven, at certain times he had a beard. And each of these things rendered him very, very different in appearance, almost such that you wouldn't think it was the same person.
We got Mr. Bierke's time and attendance records. We did see on the day of the offense that he had left work early. He mentioned something about feeling ill or not feeling well. And, that to us right there was like, wow, he wasn't at work.
We learned that he had already given notice at his job and at his apartment that he was leaving his job and that he would be moving out of his apartment, breaking his lease, and he had planned to become a traveling nurse. And so had we made this arrest even a month later, not only would he have been gone, he would have been in a position to victimize women all over the country and continue moving on, making it even harder to find him or to identify him as the perpetrator.
Investigators start looking into Jesse Bierke's background to try and understand what kind of person he is.
He was married, he had a child, he had a daughter. He had previously been married and divorced, and his attorney said for him that that divorce had impacted him mentally in a way that maybe contributed to these crimes. He was also sexually assaulted himself. He was sexually abused as a young child, as an 8-year-old, and that was something he had never dealt with in therapy until he committed these crimes. An older man, when he was 8 years old, had sexually violated him and introduced him to pornography.
Early on in the legal proceedings, Jesse Bierke still maintains his innocence, and his loved ones believe him.
Everyone in his life had no understanding that this was happening or could happen. I think his family, even with the DNA evidence, had some belief that there had been a mistake, because that does happen with this DNA evidence, which is one argument to be cautious about the use of it. But he told them it wasn't me, and they believed him because, like I said, he was a nurse, he was a father, he was by all accounts, a good husband. He just had this other side that he went to great lengths to conceal. From the evidence, it seems like he had started doing Google searches of genetic genealogy before he was caught, but after committing these 2 assaults, and did not commit another one, probably because he realized there was a new method by which he could be caught. He'd worn gloves, he'd turned off his cell phone, he'd taken steps to conceal his identity that likely would have been successful, again, if not for this new use of technology. And he was smart enough to recognize that before it happened.
Prosecutors decide to try both the Fairfax and Alexandria cases together in Alexandria, and a trial date is set.
We indicted him in Alexandria for rape, use of a firearm, and abduction. Later on in the case, he was charged in Fairfax County, but we agreed to resolve all of the matters in our Alexandria case. That can be done if the defendant himself waives objection. So generally speaking, normally we would have to prosecute the Fairfax offense in Fairfax and the Alexandria offense in Alexandria. But if the defendant waives any objection to the jurisdiction of the court, they can be all put together in one case.
In the Fairfax case, he was indicted for similar offenses: for rape, for object sexual penetration, abduction with intent to defile, and then he was charged with 1 count of use of a firearm and commission of a felony.
Though the evidence is damning, investigators still need the victims to return to the United States.
If we hadn't been able to find the victims, there would have been nothing that we could do. So the Constitution guarantees an offender the right to confront their accuser, and there are rules of evidence that prohibit hearsay from being admitted at trial. So if we hadn't been able to find these victims, then there would have been nothing that we could have done to prosecute the cases. Both cases required their willingness to come back to the United States and testify at trial.
Detective Clinch contacts the City of Alexandria victim and builds a respectful and trusting relationship with her.
She was here in the United States and was a victim of this horrible crime, and left with essentially no justice. I had reached out to her and started talking to her, introduced myself, and just let her know that we didn't forget about you. I continued to talk to her throughout the investigation, talked to her, at least once a week, if not more.
And that relationship ultimately resulted in her agreeing when we had a trial date set and when we were ultimately able to start the prosecution, she agreed to come over.
With a mountain of evidence compiled against him, Jesse Bjerke enters a plea.
The defendant ultimately entered a plea of guilty in Alexandria, but it was a conditional plea of guilt. And what that meant was he was admitting guilt, but he was reserving the right to appeal a motion to suppress that had been litigated in the case. The biggest motion, the one that he wanted to appeal, dealt with whether the police needed a search warrant to develop a DNA profile from the items that they had taken from his trash or from the straws at the restaurant.
He cried and he apologized for what he'd done and said he couldn't really explain it. He apologized to his family for lying to them because, again, up until I think pretty much the moment he confessed, his wife and his mother-in-law were holding out hope that he had somehow been misidentified, and I think he had told them that.
The sentencing for Jesse Bjerke, I was in the courtroom at the time, one of the few reporters there, and watched the victim in the 2016 attack give her victim impact statement. She told the judge that she was a dreamer. Anything was possible. She told the judge that after that day, she doesn't believe in anything. In her words, my life ended that day.
We argued for a sentence of 80 years. The defense argued for a sentence of far less time, essentially asking the court to consider his daughter and that he wanted to be a part of his daughter's life and that a lengthy sentence essentially wasn't necessary in the case. Our argument, the Commonwealth's argument after the victim impact statements, was focused upon the danger that he presented to the community. This is someone who had committed this offense twice without any obvious remorse, with an extensive amount of planning, both in selecting victims who were vulnerable, likely to leave the country and unable to participate in prosecution any further, but also in avoiding detection and wearing the gloves and picking secluded locations on days without witnesses. All of these things led us to believe that he was someone who would commit this offense again. The court ultimately, across all of the cases, sentenced him to a term of 65 years.
Jesse Bjerke is now in prison, but is there justice for the victims?
Whether justice was served is a tough question. I think for the community, justice was served. I think for the victims, that's something only they can answer.
In some ways, especially because the victims had come from another country, I think there's a sense that, you let someone in as a guest, someone travels all the way here just for a summer to work in another place, and what they think is going to be sort of a vacation, to see the capital of another country. There's a sense that you've made a promise to that person that they will be protected. That one of the victims said for her, in some ways, it was worse than death. I think this is something that really terrorizes people, and the idea of it preys on them psychologically.
With Jesse Bjerke now behind bars, how important was genetic genealogy to solving this case?
It is helpful on several levels. One, for them to know that they can't do this anymore, that it's not the case that just because your DNA isn't in a database that you can go on and commit these crimes without any fear of detection. But it's also really important for the community to know that we can catch these people, that this is the type of crime that prior to the last few years, there isn't anything we would have been able to do. This would have remained an unsolved case forever without genetic genealogy.
Genetic genealogy was the linchpin of this case. To put it bluntly, if we had not utilized the technique, I am very confident that Mr. Bjerke would never have been identified, and he would be free right this moment as we are conducting this interview to hurt someone else and to assault another human being with impunity.